Hello students, welcome to day 3 of our notes from lesson 5. Today we're going to be talking about what limits growth of populations. The bell ringer that you're going to complete today is, if you could choose how you interact with another species, would you choose parasitism, mutualism, or commensalism? So please prepare to share your response with your teacher. They may be expecting that you complete that question and submit it. Throughout this unit, we are going to be talking about and learning about how to identify variables that govern the changes in population size and factors that actually limit population size. You're also going to learn about how to explain reproductive and survivorship patterns in a population. Some of the key terms that we will be covering throughout this unit are listed here. So again, if you are trying to be successful on the test, make sure you know your vocabulary. That's the starting point for any successful journey on a test, is to make sure you know the vocab, especially in science. It is the language of science. So without the foundation of vocabulary, it's going to be very difficult to be successful. After you learn the vocabulary, you have to make sure you can apply the vocabulary to the concepts being taught. Alright, so what we're going to look at is populations. And populations can do things, right? So they can grow, they can shrink, they could also remain stable. So a population is a group of interbreeding individuals of the same species. So when we look at a population, it's a group of interbreeding individuals of the same species. So most populations live together in groups. For example, a pack of wolves, a school of fish, or a flock of birds. Living in group really allows them to cluster where the resources are available, and that grouping also protects from predators and gives predator species such as wolves a better chance of getting a meal, especially when they work together. So there are 4 variables that govern changes in population: birth, death, immigration, and emigration. So as we look at those 4 things, population increases in size through birth and immigration. The arrival of individuals from outside the population is immigration. And of course, birth is, well, birth. It's the bringing about a new species from the parent, right? So the egg is fertilized, the organism grows and develops, and eventually you have a new organism. Populations decrease in size due to death, emigration. So when you hear death and emigration, you should think a decrease in population size. So emigration is the departure of individuals from the population. So individuals, let's say I leave the United States and I go to Canada. In that situation, I am emigrating the United States, and I would be considered an immigrant into Canada, for example. So the population's age structure and distribution of individuals among different age groups have dramatic effect on how quickly those populations are actually going to be able to grow or decline. So age groups are defined in terms of organisms not mature enough to reproduce, those capable of reproduction, and those too old to reproduce. So when we look at a population, those are some of the characteristics that we look at, and that help us determine how quickly a population can change. So every ecosystem has a range of tolerance, and that is a range of variations in the physical environment that the population can actually survive in. So everyone in a population may have a slightly different tolerance for a range for temperature, chemical factors, or other physical factors. So this happens due to the small differences in genetic makeup, health, and age. So this is very common in our human population, right? We all have these slight differences or genetic variations. Some of us are more tolerant of the heat or cold than others. In a classroom, that becomes very evident. There are some students who are in shorts and a t-shirt, and other students who are in a hoodie and long pants. All right. So this is not unique to organisms just within an ecosystem. So, for example, trout populations do best within a narrow range of temperatures. However, a few individuals within that population can survive above and below that range. So if the water temperature greatly exceeds the narrow window, none of the trout will survive. So as long as if the temperature gets too extreme, then none of the trout will survive. But if it's just slightly out of that range, some of the trout will die, but not all of them. So those small differences help put kind of natural selection into play. So those tolerant individuals are going to be able to survive and reproduce, and those who aren't tolerant will not be able to survive and reproduce. And again, this is going to be dependent on the environmental conditions. So what an environment might do now is not maybe what it's going to do in the future. So what's a beneficial adaptation now? Let's say the trout is has a tolerance for cold water, but then the water over the next few years starts to get warmer and warmer and warmer. Then what was once an actual benefit now becomes something that is detrimental to that specific trout. So there are chemical and physical factors that determine the number of organisms in a population. So one or more of those factors are called limiting factors, are more important than other factors in regulating the population growth. So just depending on the species will depend on what those factors that are actually going to have the biggest impact. So on land, precipitation is often the limiting factor. So having a low amount of precipitation in the desert ecosystems can limit plant growth in the desert. However, too much rainfall can also kill plants. In aquatic ecosystems, limiting factors are water temperature, depth, clarity of the water, how clear it is, the availability of nutrients, acidity, salinity, how much oxygen there is, how dissolved in the water, how much pollution there is. So, for example, too much acidity in an aquatic environment can harm some of the organisms that are not tolerant to it. So those things limit population growth, and they regularly change within an ecosystem. So density is also another factor that affects population sizes. So population density is how many individuals that are in a population within a defined area, square foot, square mile, square inch, or defined by volume, cubic feet, cubic yards, cubic inches, or gallons. So it can be described in several different ways. If a population density goes up or increases, the density-dependent factors play a vital role. So by density-dependent, we mean factors that do depend on how many organisms are living in those areas. So in more dense populations, things like parasites, diseases, they can spread easier because there's more organisms to help pass that parasite. There are more hosts, basically, to host the parasites, and that can cause higher death rates. So higher populations, though, it is easy for individuals to also find mates and reproduce. So you have this, both factors playing a role in the population. So drought and climate change are considered density independent because they're going to affect the population size regardless of how many organisms live there. If there's no water, it's going to impact all of the organisms that live there. And it does not matter if there's 100,000 people or 10,000 people, it's going to impact the population either way. So there are limits to how a population can grow. So when we look at research, it is found that rapidly growing populations of any species eventually reaches some size limit placed by limiting factors. So factors including sunlight, water, temperature, space, nutrients, or even exposure to predators or infectious disease. So the sum of all of those factors is known as environmental resistance. So looking at all of those factors and how well these organisms are able to, or the population is able to tolerate them, is known as environmental resistance. So limiting factors are largely determined by the carrying capacity, which is defined as the maximum amount of species that can inhabit, or rather the habitat can actually sustain indefinitely. So for example, if you have if you're trapped in your house and you start inviting friends over, eventually you're going to run out of food, right? So there are some limiting factors. Now, some of those friends might go home, some of them might stay, but eventually you're going to run out of food and something's going to have to change. Either emigration will occur, meaning your friends will go home and go to a different house, or eventually they will starve. But chances are pretty good they're going to go to a different house with food, or maybe call and order some. So ecosystems are really no different. They have limits as to what they can hold. So if you think of an ecosystem as the environment, that a specific range in which an organism can live within, it's going to have a limited amount of resources. Our world, for example, has a carrying capacity for humans, and it is thought that we will near that carrying capacity by year 2050. So at that point, our population will be around 10 billion people, and we're thought to hit our carrying capacity between 9 and 13 billion, depending on the sources and the calculations they're using and the predictions that they're making based on the data that they have. So as populations reach the carrying capacity of a habitat, there's two types of growth curves we will see. So it's going to start off as a J curve. The J curve is on the left. The J curve kind of looks like a J, so it's easy to remember. So what you see here is this exponential growth. So we have just this crazy growth of the population in a very short period of time. Eventually, what's going to happen is this curve is going to level out, and it's going to turn into an S-shaped curve, because populations can't grow indefinitely unless they have an infinite supply of resources, which, since we all live on the same planet, there's eventually going to be a limit on the resources that are provided. So the S curve is what we call the logistic growth curve. And the growth fluctuates around certain levels and will eventually raise and drop in small amounts due to limiting factors. So when we look at carrying capacity, it's going to basically hover along this line. And this blue line doesn't really show it that well, but you'd have this kind of, if we were to zoom in on this line, we'd see a whole bunch of ups and downs that are occurring within that population. But it's kind of been smoothed out for this explanation. But the carrying capacity would be represented by the maximum amount or the average of the maximum amount that this population could sustain. So when we look at population growth, some populations do not make a smooth transition from exponential growth to logistic growth. So instead, they can actually use up their resources and will temporarily overshoot or exceed the carrying capacity. And that's not very good, because that means a lot of the organisms in the population are going to die. And that's actually literally called dieback, or population crash. So this is going to happen unless part of the population can find more resources due to from this overshoot. All right, so I think often happens. We've seen this with reindeer when they're introduced to a small island in the Bering Sea. They basically go in and eat up all of the vegetation. Population does great, but that vegetation can't grow back fast enough, and the population just plummets because there's not enough food and it can't grow back quick enough. So populations can also be affected by reproductive patterns. So different species have vary in how they reproduce. So species with a high rate of population increase are called R-selected species, and they tend to have short lifespans, and they can produce a lot of small offspring in a very short period of time. But with those offspring, they don't care for them and do not offer protection to those offspring. So those offspring are kind of left to take care of themselves. So when you think about algae that's growing in a pool or a pond, or bacteria in most insects, those are going to be R-selected species, and they're going to produce large numbers of offspring or descendants, and only a few of them are going to survive. So that's going to continue from generation to generation. And for those organisms, it's good for them to produce lots of offspring, because natural selection is going to work very quickly on those offspring as well. So these R-selected species are opportunist breeders, and basically that means they reproduce so rapid when an opportunity opens up. So if there's a forest fire or a new habitat that occurs, let's say that you uncover your pool, or you put in, maybe the neighborhood put in a new pond or a new landscaping feature. If there's nothing done to that, very quickly you're going to see that some of these species like algae are going to take over in a very short period of time. So on the other side of that, we have species that are what we call K-selected species, and they reproduce later in life. They have only a very limited amount of offspring, but they have long lifespans. K-selected mammal species develop inside their mothers, and they're born pretty large. After birth, they mature slowly until they reach a reproductive age, and then they can begin the cycle again. But K-selected species, they're good at competitive conditions when nearing the carrying capacity. They're also, they include us as humans, elephants, whales, birds of prey, and some large and long-lived plants. K-selected animals have slow reproduction rate. They're pretty vulnerable to reproduction. So organisms, or rather extinction, not reproduction, they're pretty vulnerable to extinction. So when you think about elephants, the giant redwood trees, sharks, and even California's southern sea otter. So these are K-selected species. So they take a while to get to reproductive age, and then eventually they don't have a whole lot of offspring when they do. So the process of repopulating is much slower than for R-selected species. So when we look at populations, we have what's called a survivorship curve for various species. So a survivorship curve shows percentages of members of a population that survive at different ages. There are three different generalized types of survivorship curves. There's what's called late loss, and that shows a population of high survivorship until they get to a certain age, and then there's high mortality. So mammals fit into that curve. So this curve over here on the top, that is where us humans fall. So what that means is a lot of the organisms that are born survive, and they do pretty good for a long time. But as we get older, they get to a certain point and population dies off pretty quickly. Or at least not the population, but the individuals based on their age. So constant loss shows a constant death rate at all ages. So starting off here, we have birth, and right from birth all the way down to death. And finally, early loss, you have annual plants and many fish species. They have low survivorship early in life, and then as they progress, they you can see that later in life, if they make it that long, they can tend to do okay. So they have low survivorship early in life, but if they survive to a certain point, they can survive for a long period of time. So that concludes our notes on ecological, those on populations rather, and this will be our bell ringer for day 4. So a little preview to that. But I hope you found these notes helpful, and make sure you answer these questions and be prepared to submit these things to your teacher as requested by them. I hope this was helpful. Have a good day.